Thank you.
All right.
Okay, so let me know if you guys signed up and you can get access to the portal. That's the first thing we'll do. Okay, Lydia has it. Ray, Manny, Sean, Keith.
Yeah, I'm trying to get in.
Awesome.
I just signed up, so
Okay, yeah, you have to wait for a confirmation email and
yeah, I'm waiting.
do all that.
Ray, would you prefer to share my screen and see this rather than setting it up for yourself?
Oh, you guys have a little internal Teams going on? That works.
I'll call you and just decline if you prefer not to.
Lydia, he gave a thumbs up.
Great, I didn't see it, sorry.
Yes, yes, Lydia, please.
Navpreet, Joe, you good?
Yeah, nothing yet. I just checked my spam folder too.
Oh, you're waiting for the email? Okay.
Yeah.
How about you, Curtis?
We've got one here that I'm gonna utilize.
Great. John?
Yeah, I just sent the email. I just got the email and I'm just putting in my password right now.
Great. So before we jump in, does everybody understand like why somebody use Nerdio? I'm sorry, Windows Virtual Desktop in Azure, and which scenarios where you may not necessarily need it? Should we talk about that?
Sure, that's a good place to start.
Yeah, so let me.
I'd really like additional thoughts on that from you, Tony.
Sure.
I know why I would, but.
Yeah, so the reason why somebody use virtual desktop in Azure, and it's not because we're trying to sell it or we're trying to push it. And yes, it's one way we make money, but you know, at the end of the day, we want to get you guys to get into Azure. And like Rick said last week when he kicked off this webinar series, his you know venture in was try to get your clients using anything in Azure, right? Once you get your foot in the door, you know, you'll start using it and things will start making sense, and then you'll find a you know, maybe a need to use virtual desktop sometime down the line. But one of the main reasons why, you know, I think everybody should use WVD is because so let me go back up. There's two camps, right? And Elaine and I have talked about this, right? You have clients that are very small that don't really do anything and just use files inside of Azure, and maybe all their line of business apps are website based, like browser based. Those guys don't need virtual desktop. Like you can get them into Azure using Intune, and well, Intune is now called Microsoft Endpoint Manager, and get them into SharePoint and use OneDrive, and that'd be the way they sort of work, right? But then you have this other group of customers that have very specific line of business applications, something like a QuickBooks or a Sage or something industry specific. Those applications that have typically a server backend where it runs a database, and then there's a client front end software that lives on a desktop. Those are the scenarios where Windows Virtual Desktop comes into play, because you know, the problem that you're going to get when people think about going to Azure, they think about just putting their servers in the cloud. They think about putting their file servers, their main controllers, their application servers, their SQL servers in the cloud. And then they really don't even think about the desktops, because that's really what's sitting on their desk, and that's how so they think that, you know, going and putting these servers into Azure, and you have something like a VPN connecting back to the office, that'll be good enough to have those applications run. And many times it's not, right? So those applications have databases that are much larger than the gig, you know, and the larger the database is, the harder you're going to be able to run that application over a VPN. Just trying to fit all that data over the VPN tunnel to talk back and forth between the client and the server is where the problem resides. So the whole idea of having a virtual desktop is that you have these Windows 10 machines that are sitting in the same local area network inside of your Azure environment alongside your other servers. And when they talk to each other, they talk at local area network speeds. And these virtual desktops are going to allow you to have your customers experience the application as fast as they did when it was running on premise, or if not better, right? So that's probably one of the top reasons why somebody would use it. And then of course there's other reasons. Maybe your client wants to just work from home and want to have a similar secure desktop to work out of. That might be a big scenario, but those are sort of the top scenarios of why, or reasons why somebody would use virtual desktop. Any questions about that, or any we can have a discussion about it. That's really what I want. And Lydia, we could use your your first customer as an example. Like, tell me what they had that really, Lydia had a customer that we helped onboard maybe a couple of months ago, and prior to Lydia taking them over from an MSP standpoint, they were in another private cloud using virtual desktops already. So it was sort of a obvious reason to, but I'm sure there was some kind of line of business application that they required that where the design of it had to be virtual desktops. Can you share with the rest of us
Well,
what that
in
would
that,
look like?
in that case, they have, it's a construction related organization, and they have supers that are out in job trailers everywhere. They have a situation in their particular office where the internet connection is not always the best connectivity wise. If you hit under 32 degrees, their internet goes down, plain and simple, no way around it, even with different providers. So them moving to their houses and still being able to be functional was critical in their mind of being able, that business continuity. In addition to that, the 365 really gave them the capability for the entire, organization to be with Exchange in the cloud instead of having to try and do that locally. And so their biggest applications that they deal with are based on design for what they do as an organization. So the AutoCAD and their coding estimation software is really the other element that made that work really well in the cloud, because Tony was able to give us a way to, even when they have a little USB fob that they've got to have, that the software interacts with for like a security key kind of thing. And Tony was able to get us connected up with a little device that you plug into the network and it mirrors into the cloud. So that even that kind of a something that would stop you from going to the cloud was resolved, and it was facilitated with what Nerdio was doing for us. So that worked out really well.
Yeah, and can you share with some of the line of business applications and like, I remember when we were doing this, there was a server piece of it, right, that ran on a server, and then the desktops had a client. So that's like what I was trying to mention, that's usually one of the big reasons why you would go virtual desktop as opposed to, and QuickBooks is another one, right? If you have QuickBooks, you can't run QuickBooks off OneDrive, can't run QuickBooks off of SharePoint. So those are the reasons. Anybody else, any comments or questions about why WVD and when to use it and when it's really needed? No? Okay, great. So yeah, and we have other partners that are strictly 100% doing WVD. They will no longer sell on-premise equipment if they can help it. And it's a way for them to sort of standardize their practice and to have things done the same way for as many customers as possible, because then their engineers are all trained to just know sort of one way to do something, one way to kind of manage IT, and it's the way that sort of enterprise organizations have always been doing it. So it creates a lot of scale and scalability to your practice. So today we're going to just talk about sort of how to determine the cost of running this stuff in Azure. And so moving to the cloud is sort of the most challenging aspects of it is really around pricing and packaging the solution. We can all argue that the technology, of course, is sort of confusing, but that's, that doesn't matter if you can't sell the product, right? Or you can't figure out what the cost is, so you can know how much money you're about to make on this. So we're talking about how to deliver a fixed cost offering in a variable cost world. So Azure is a very consumption-based cloud. That's very scary for most people. Like, how do you really know exactly how much you're going to consume? What is your month-to-month going to be every single month after you deploy? Is it even close to what our estimates are looking like? So all those things are sort of questions that, especially if you haven't done it before, probably comes to mind. And how do MSPs achieve the highest margin when they sell Azure? Right? So you all hear that selling cloud, you can't really make money. Um, you're lucky if you made $1 per seat when you're selling Office 365. How do people make money selling Azure? So if you do it right, most people are probably making at least 50% markup on a monthly basis when selling and bundling Azure packages with Virtual Desktop. So we'll talk about how to do that. And so step one is to gather information about the customer, right? So moving a customer to Azure and quoting Azure is not the same as moving and quoting things on premise. And Lydia actually and I went through. Sorry, I keep using you as an example. But it comes to mind, right? When George and I were kind of quoting that customer out with you last time, we kept bumping into what that would look like if you were quoting out an on-prem server and how like it was supposed to be different when going to Azure, right? Like we always bump into that because on premise, what we tend to think about is, let's over quote their environment, right? We know we need this today, but we're buying a piece of hardware for the next 3 to 5 years. So maybe we double the RAM we need. Maybe we double the CPU we need, and we don't care because it's something that you buy today that you'll probably have for the next, like I said, 3 to 5 years. But in Azure, you don't want to do that because the whole point of Azure is consuming what you really need to consume and not paying for something you don't really need. So one of the biggest challenges is figuring out what exactly that server really needs and really uses and not overspec it. Because if you overspec it, you're now paying more for that server from a rental perspective than, and when you rent something over time, it eventually costs more than on-premise. So so knowing how your applications function, knowing your user habits, and knowing your real true system requirements of the line of business app is really going to help. Because like I said, most people are so used to just overspecking, and they tend to go do the same thing in Azure, and that's really where they waste money. Because if you gave something a 16-core processor and really only needs 2 or 4, then all that processor you're renting from Microsoft goes to waste because you're never using it. So what I'm about to give you is a list of things that you need to really understand well from an end user and customer perspective for you to be able to help you quote correctly, right? So that's understanding every single line of business application, how it interacts, who their vendor is, do they have support for those vendors? Because when you're migrating those things, you need to make sure those guys got your back, because you might be in a situation where you're doing this over a weekend and, oh crap, I never really thought about how to migrate or export their SQL, right? So all those things are something that you want to get all your ducks in a row first before you even start the project, because when somebody starts the project, the Azure costs start ticking, and you want to have all your ducks in a row before you start the project, because somebody who's prepared to do this and versus somebody who's sort of figuring things out along the way, there's a lot of money wasted in those first 3 months, right? And Lydia probably learned maybe a little bit of the hard way. Not completely her fault, because she was leaving another provider that would not play ball and gave us all a hard time getting the information. But I think after learning from that, the next customer you try, you'll want to make sure you got everything in a row before you start, because paying that pay-as-you-go cost when you're starting out and then discovering the stuff, all the time you waste waiting is time that Azure's charging you money, right? It's not like, go buy something from Tech Data or Ingram and you got net 90 days to pay. They start charging you the moment you turn it on. So these things are important: understanding the application, understanding how your end users use it, what time they use it, what time they start working. On premise, when you sell them a desktop, you don't really care, right? That the machine's theirs, they can use it anytime they want. But in Azure, we're talking about cost savings and saving as much as possible. So understanding their user habits allows us to use some DevOps technology to lower costs when it's applicable. Get system requirements, make sure you find out what the recommended system requirements are, not what you think they need or overspec it. And from that aspect, we need to know CPU or vCPU requirements, RAM requirements, use storage requirements, and how often that maybe application or server needs to be backed up. So some of these are qualifying questions. I can send you guys a list of this if you guys ping me at the end of the presentation. This list of questions is, in my opinion, the minimum things you need to know about a customer before, even coming to us or to the calculator for a quote. Because if you don't have any of these, you're not going to really be able to effectively answer these questions, and therefore you're not getting an accurate cost. So how many computers do you have, right? That's a cool question. If they have a 20 user environment, how many concurrent users at the same time typically log on? That's very important, because you know, a lot of times people come to me and say, I have 30 users that can possibly use the system. But then when we look at it, it's only like 7 or 8 people on at any given time. So you don't want to spec the environment out for 30 people. You want to spec it out for the 8 or 10, right? Because that's gonna, again, that difference is gonna save you a lot of money over time. Do you have any customers using sort of a graphic intensive application like AutoCAD, Photoshop, Revit, SolidWorks, those type of applications? And that's going to give us special consideration when we quote out these desktops, because these desktops need to have GPU capability in them. So having a GPU allows us to render those 2D, 3D graphics in those applications and make them run much, much faster. But you know, most clients, if they're not in the construction or engineering space, probably won't need it. So again, provide us a list of all your VMs, including its role, what it does, what applications run in it, the RAM requirements of those applications, the CPU, and the used storage requirements. And this is the biggest mistake people will come to me with. They'll give me like a quote from the Dell website, or to give me a list of their physical hardware servers. And they say, well, you know, there's 8 VMs running in it, but I only have the hypervisor details. Well, I can't really help you, because we need to know what those VMs run exactly, and how to carve it out, right? Because when you're buying on-prem equipment, you're buying the entire box, and from inside that box, you'll probably install ESXi or Hyper-V, and then divvy out that big box into little small VMs, right? But I got to know what VMs are specifically in Azure, because Azure itself is a giant hypervisor, and you're really just renting out little carved out guest VMs. So we need to know what those VMs are. What line of business applications are using? Are you using QuickBooks? Does it require SQL, right? Is it SQL Express, or is it SQL Standard, or SQL Enterprise? And I need to know that primarily because of licensing. So licensing a SQL is not so straightforward, especially when you're dealing with a SQL Standard. It can get quite expensive. And so it's very important to understand what SQL requirements they have, because we definitely don't want to rent SQL licensing if we don't need it. And I've caught this so many times where people tell me, yeah, they use SQL, but then they don't really know what SQL they use. And when we look into the application, we were like 2 seconds away from buying like an $8,000 license when we found out they can get away with SQL Express, which is free. So that's a very important one. And SQL is licensed by the core in Azure, not by the user cal model, which is a little bit different, right? So again, a lot of people will on-premise will say, hey, my on-prem SQL server has 8 CPUs. Right, and they'll try to quote out 8 CPUs in Azure, but I'll tell them, do you really need 8 CPUs, or can they really get away with 4? Because buying 4 CPUs of SQL licensing versus 8 is like almost like a $4,000 difference, right? So again, be very careful and very know exactly what the real requirements are. How much data do you currently have? So a lot of people will say, my current server has 2 terabytes of data, and I'm like, well, how much do they really use? And they go, I only use 400 gigs of it. Well, it's better to just buy 500 gigs of data than to go 2 terabytes to begin with, because I can always increase and pay the difference, but I don't want to pay the larger amount just because that's what I have on premise. Okay. How many hours does an average worker work? That's good to know from an auto scaling perspective. So Nerdio has some capability to turn your sessions off when they're not being used. So if you're not sure of that, we're forced to kind of have to leave the machine on 24/7. And if you're able to kind of use a machine for, let's say, under 300 hours per month, you'll save money. So knowing those hours and how they work is very important. And it's, when you set this up for the first time, you watch people actually log in, you actually be surprised, right? I actually did this for a client of mine when I worked at an MSP. That's how I found Nerdio and started working for Nerdio. I had a client that wanted to go to Azure, and they're a wealth advising company, and we always thought their work hours were from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. But at night, when we got them into WVD, we actually saw that the last person stops working at 2 in the morning, and the first person starts work at 4 in the morning. So my true downtime for that specific client was really only 2 hours, and I had no idea the entire 8 years I had the person as a customer. So finding out their work hours is essential. What type of Office 365 licenses do they have, right? So that's important as well, because to run WVD legally, you need the Microsoft 365 Business Premium license. So the reason why I asked that is, sometimes people have just business standard. So at least I know I need to pay $7.50 more, the difference, to kind of get them to the proper license. And
E5 will work on that as well, right?
say that again, Lydia?
E5 will work for that as
Yes.
well, because that
Yes.
includes the Microsoft Windows license.
Correct. Yeah. Anything Microsoft Business Premium and above, which is M365 E5, E3. And for whatever reason, if your client doesn't use Office apps or don't use Exchange Online, you can technically get away with the Windows 10 E3 license, which is just $7 a month. So if they just want WVD, but they don't want to use Office apps or they don't use email online, you can get that for like maybe a frontline worker or something. And then the next question is, how do they currently back up? Are they using Datto? Are they using Axion? Like, what is their retention? How frequently are they being backed up? So those things we want to make sure we either match like for like in Azure, or at least, have something to kind of mirror off of, right? We want to at least provide them the same backup and restore capability as they had on premise. So that's something good to know. And then do they do a lot of printing and scanning? So that's important, right? Because these virtual desktops are not physical computers. And so when you're doing scanning, and especially scanning, if you have maybe like a doctor's office and maybe the intake desk, they scan insurance cards and medical cards all the time. And the EMR application uses like a Tween scanner. The Tween scanner is set up so it can just talk directly to the scanner, scan something in. And it's good to know those things because there's additional software you have to purchase and consider if you have that specific use case. But most of the time, printing just works fine redirection wise. But it's scanning where if we don't know about a specific way the customer scans, after go live, you'll find out that something doesn't work, which then you'll have to go and purchase a license for then, which is sort of not fun. So again, something to kind of think about when you're thinking about quoting WVD. What other peripherals are you using, right? Are you using scanners? I'm sorry, we just talked about scanners, check printers, those check scanners that talk and interface directly to the bank. Do they use webcams, microphones? So those are the things we want to know, because if you have a company that isn't using any of those things, that helps you select sort of some of the best thing clients to use based on their use case. Okay, do you plan on using, moving everything to Azure or just maybe parts of it? Right. So in that hybrid scenario, we want to know that and what's going to the cloud, what's not going to the cloud. And maybe you have customers that are just maybe not even local, right? Maybe you have customers that come in from other countries. That's also good to know. Some MSPs have clients that where their offices are maybe in the US, but they have like, employees in the Philippines or India that use the environment at nighttime. Those are the things that we want to definitely know. So just a quick review, if you're not a CSP distributor, become a CSP distributor, leverage Azure reserved instances, leverage Azure hybrid benefits, and leverage the auto scaling. So those are things that we're going to talk about when we do the sample quote. So does anybody here want a review on reserved instances and Azure hybrid benefits? Everybody understand what they are? They're levers to save money in Azure. Right? One of them is a commit to the hardware. The other one is a commit to the software. And if you make sure those two are in place, that equates to about an 80% discount off of Azure MSRP. So when you say to me, well, how can somebody make money selling Azure? Well, imagine getting an 80% discount off of the MSRP, and then you're selling it at somewhere near the MSRP, and the margins are up to 80% if you do it right. But unfortunately, most people don't do it immediately or think that this is automatic and don't contact the distributors to make the order and place the order. And they lapse several months paying the pay-as-you-go costs. That's probably the number one mistake I see people doing all the time.
Yeah, Tony, quick question. So when we did ours, it was PAX 8 telling us not to reserve that, put in the reserved instances right away, and told us to wait like 3 to 6 months. So we were paying a lot of money until we did that. So,
well, that's why you don't listen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those guys will probably tell you that because they don't want you to make a mistake and pick the wrong VM size. Because at the time, I think you did this probably like 2 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the time, Microsoft, it was unclear that Microsoft was going to charge a penalty or not, and it was very difficult for the distributors to force the MSP to pay a penalty if they were to cancel. So now it's actually very clear that Microsoft's not charging any penalties, and so it really doesn't matter. And they probably won't give you that advice today. But
Yeah.
back 2 years ago, I could imagine them giving you that because some MSPs would reserve something and then make a mistake, change it or cancel it, and then it'd be up to the distributors to kind of foot the bill, which they were very careful about wanting not to do, obviously, right? But but now that's changed. So there's no reason why you shouldn't do a reserve instance on day one,
Okay.
and you can make exchanges and cancel, and there's no penalties doing either.
All right.
And there's a new Azure CSP SKU coming out. It's called Azure Commerce or New Azure Commerce instead of Azure Program or Azure CSP. And that actually lets the MSP handle the reserve instances without having to go through a distributor, which is going to be much easier for you to manage directly from inside the Azure portal mini.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. So there's two cost estimators that we want to maybe make sure that we're aware of at least. So there's the Azure Calculator, which is hosted by Microsoft, and that thing calculates absolutely everything. But the problem with that is that you really need to know what you're looking for in order to calculate exactly what you need. And if you're using the Azure Calculator, there's always like a little bug in the back of your head that says, did I do this right or did I miss anything, right? And if you're not sure about that, then you're pretty reluctant to kind of go to a customer and say, hey, we think this is your cost, because it's always going to come, it's going to bite you if you made a mistake, right? So that's why Nerdio invested time to make our own cost estimator, where our cost estimator asks you the necessary questions to have you kind of make the best decisions to come up with the exact accurate cost. So what we're going to do today is actually the trial I had you guys sign up for. We're actually going to go into the trial, log in, and on the left side, there's a billing button and there's a cost estimator button. So can we all get to that screen where, hopefully you guys have two screens and you can watch me and you have the cost estimator in the other screen. So the first thing you're going to see is this in the estimator. Can everybody let me know that they're already there? Okay, thanks. So the left side is if you just plain old want to do infrastructure. So if you don't want to do WVDs and you know that your workload doesn't require it, you could do infrastructure as a service. Or if you want to do infrastructure as a service plus WVD, which is probably what 98% of people do, it's what we call the IT as a service use case. So that's the box on the right. So you can select either or, and we'll kind of talk through both. So is there anybody on this call that's going to do infrastructure only without WVD? Can you raise your hand now so I can make sure, or do we all want to do a WVD use case? Okay, so we'll do a WVD use case. Okay, so the first question in section 2 is how many computer users you have. So I don't know if you guys have a client that you've already thinking about, but let's think of that client and say how many computer users will they use in this environment. Just plug that into the calculator. So in my example, I'm going to say 27 users. All right, and the next question is which desktop experience will you use? So are you going to use Windows Virtual Desktop or remote desktop services? Is there anybody here who maybe want me to spend like 5 minutes differentiating RDS with WVD? Yeah, Sean, yes? Yes. So RDS is something we all know. It's terminal server. It's been around for like 20 years. WVD is a new service. It was released in October 2019. It's essentially the same. It's not the same at all. But if you're going to simplify it, it's the same thing as RDS, except it's Windows 10 multi-session instead of Windows Server multi-session. So that's got a couple of benefits, right? Because it's a real true desktop operating system, not like a Windows Server operating system with a skin on it. So it's going to have your desktop features that maybe you've always wanted. It's got this profile management tool that Microsoft includes in it. It's called FSLogix. It's going to handle your user roaming profiles much better. In RDS, what you're supposed to have in an RDS environment is an RD gateway server that you put in the DMZ. But most MSPs don't do that because it's an extra VM, extra cost. And so what most people end up doing is just making somebody SSL into the firewall and then go to the terminal server if that's what they need. But the cool thing about WVD is that hosted gateway server is now provided as a platform as a service feature inside of Microsoft. So Microsoft now manages the authentication, the security of WVD without you having to maintain and manage your own separate VM. And then the last thing about WVD that's superior to RDS is the licensing. It's much easier to license than it was in RDS. And there's special capabilities in WVD that will never exist in RDS. So for example, camera redirection with no lag, or audio microphone redirection. All those things worked in RDS, but didn't work well. And in WVD, they really optimized it to work very fluid, very smooth, without using a single percentage of CPU on your Windows 10 box. And offloads all that processing that the H264, all that's done on the local machine, as opposed to in the cloud, where in RDS it was always done in the cloud, and they would just peg the CPU of the RDS host. All right, so you can imagine this whole work from home scenario. A lot of people are flocking to that and using webcams and all that. That works really well. Okay, so for all intents and purposes, WVD is the new thing that Microsoft's spending all its R&D efforts in. That's, unless you had some real reason not to use WVD, I would use WVD all the time. So it says, will any of these users need a dedicated personal desktop? So dedicated personal desktop, and like Rick Harbor said last week, there are different iterations of WVD. You can use WVD like a terminal server where you have one server and multiple people logging into it, or you can use WVD in a one-to-one scenario, like one person assigned to one VM. And maybe you want to use that for like maybe the partners of the company, right? You want to separate them out from the regular pool. But I would say 95% of people don't separate them out, and as long as you sort of size the environment correctly, they should work just fine. Now, in Lydia's scenario and in her client that we just kind of onboarded a couple of months ago, they did use direct desktops, and I forget the reason why, but maybe that's what they had before, or maybe there was some kind of
At the
licensing
time, we
thing.
weren't clear, Tony. You were hesitant to go to the pooled resources because we didn't know if some of their applications would work in that environment. We have since discovered that they will, and that's why we want to transition them over to the pooled environments now.
Okay.
So
Yeah, so we should talk about that, but that's going to save you a significant amount of money by doing that.
Yeah.
So, and you obviously don't have to let the customer know, and that difference is more margin in your pocket, right? So that's the name of the game, right? Set a static cost. Hopefully that's how you did it, and then do everything you possibly can on your back end to lower your own cost. So it says, how many desktop users do we need graphic intensive needs? So that's your GPU users. So most of the time it would be no, but if you have a couple of GPU users, you can put that amount of number in there. And so the rest of it will assume that they're regular pooled desktop users. Okay. Anybody have any questions about this section of the calculator? Oh, great. Okay, so the next section, we want to basically estimate the user to core ratio. So this is very important because this is exactly how we make sure that a session host isn't over provisioned or under provisioned, right? So these are different names of type of workers that Microsoft sort of made up. So you have your task worker, you have your knowledge worker, you have your professional worker, you have your power user, and sort of custom, right? So that number basically says how many users am I going to allow on a vCPU on a session host. So if you have very light task workers, meaning you have people that are really barely doing anything, you could probably fit 6 people on a vCPU on a session host. Now, I would sort of warn against doing that because Microsoft doesn't really, they for some reason think the only applications people use on their machines are Office. They don't really realize that the other people do other things. So I would take this with a grain of salt. When I quote this out, I always pick Power Worker to begin with because I'd rather overestimate and be wrong and be able to save the customer money than to underestimate, be wrong and then have to ask the customer for more money. So, this is on theory how it's supposed to work. But when I quote, and especially if you're not sure how the customer uses it, or maybe it's a new customer that you're sort of doing discovery on, I would always assume they're power users. And if I'm wrong, great, right? I get to make more money. But if I'm correct, right? And somebody tells me I only use QuickBooks, and in the middle of onboarding, somebody says, oh, but I use this application and that application. Well, that stuff's going to surprise you. And if you don't have an oversized sort of host pool environment, that's going to come back and bite you because you've already told them and settled on a deal for $180 a seat, right? So I always pick Power Worker here. So and by the way, anybody have any questions? Just stop me anytime if there's any part of this that you need help with. Of course, you can do custom and put 2 if you want. If you feel like they're maybe not a power user and they're kind of lightweight, I would probably go with 2 users per CPU core. But the things you want to really think about is, will the end user open a lot of tabs and leave them open? Do they log off at the end of the day? Do they watch videos? Do they stream music? So all those things kind of affect how the CPU is consumed. And that's another reason why I would always go Power Worker, because you just don't know at that level. Joe?
Yeah, I was going to say, do you have like a chart that we could say? Because I've got clients all across the spectrum where they'll have 30 tabs open in their web browser, and then they're running QuickBooks in the background, and then they'll be on a Zoom call as well. So
Yeah.
I mean,
I have a chart for you. So I'll show that at the end of it. I'll give you some suggestions as like, these are the most commonly used, machines for, 1 to 10 or 10 to 15, I'll give you that as well.
cool. Thanks.
Yep. So here's the important part. And this is really where you'll probably have to understand how the naming convention of Azure sort of VMs work. And I'll help you with this all day long. But at the beginning, it's kind of like scary or confusing, I would say. But so starting out, you probably need a domain controller in the environment. You still need a file server. The proxy server may be optional. You can delete that if you want. But the more important thing is, what is a B2MS or D2SV3 or all these things, right? So let me actually try to find that slide, because that'll help. Yeah, that's actually the next slide. So what are those things? And that's very important to understand, because you want to pick the one that's right, and it's very easy to pick the wrong one and not only not get the performance you're looking for, but actually even pay more for crappier performance. So there's different families in Azure of VM types, and then within those families, there's different sub families. And you don't really have to know all of them, because literally there are like 50 of them probably. And if you focus on the ones that 98% of the times you'll use, you'll basically have a chart that you can reference and pick one out of that chart that will fit your use case, right? So your domain controller, you probably don't need a 2-core 8 GB RAM machine. You probably only need a 2-core 8 GB RAM machine. So that one we use a B series, and a B series machine is a burstable machine. That's the cheapest, lowest cost machine in Azure. And I can go with the B series because most of the time your domain controller isn't really doing anything, right? They're sitting there authenticating, handling DHCP, DNS requests, and that's basically it. If you RMM into your domain controller, that thing's probably not using 10% of CPU most of the time, right? So you get your file server where your normal files are being stored. That server could be where you install QuickBooks. That server is also where the FSLogix profiles are stored. So FSLogix profiles are user profiles from the WVD host machine that gets stored there as well. And that all happens in the data disk. So you definitely want as much data as you need that from a customer shared map drive perspective. But you also want to add on top of that around 30 gigs per user for each WVD user. So for example, if I have 27 users, if I pull up my calculator, right, 27 users times 30, I know that about 810 gigs of this 2 terabyte hard drive is allocated for profile data. So I'm assuming that the rest of the 2 terabyte disk, up to 1 terabyte, is sort of users' other files, like company files, folders, PDFs, all the other documents. Right, and then you can add another, and you kind of add other VMs to this list, and this calculator will basically show you what the cost is.
Tony, let
Yep.
me stop you for just a moment. So
Sure.
you took, run that calculation, the thought process on that calculation again in terms of storage space. You were 27
Yes.
users, and how much were you giving them?
Yeah, I like to calculate at least 30 gigs per user profile.
Okay, and that came out to 810. And then how did you translate that into 2 terabytes?
Oh, because
Oh, that's
I'm
810
assuming
per
that
user.
no, that's 810 for all the user profiles that's sitting on that drive, and then the rest of the customer's normal data, like their map drives, their shares, all that was going to be about, let's say, a terabyte.
So that was more of a guesstimate. The 810 was a true calculation with an estimate of 30 gigs per
Correct. Yeah,
right?
and that's, again, it's an overestimate, but again, I'd rather be wrong and save money than to be wrong and have to ask the customer to pay more. Most people's profiles are somewhere between 15 and 20 gigs, unless you're a super power user, which I've seen up to 50 gigs. So I would say if you want to take the average, 30 is a good number to pick.
Okay.
And then it says, we notice you like to take advantage of pool desktops. We'll maintain a minimum of 1 and no more than 4. So that number comes from the user to core ratio. So that total number divided by the user core ratio, that's exactly how many session hosts that it's telling you need. And if you chose a E4 SV3, it's going to tell you need 4 of those. Now, in reality, I don't like using a 8-core machine and below for session hosts. I like to use a E series machine and either 8 or 16 cores because I have enough burst capability, right? If I have a machine too small and I have many machines, and then maybe I could fit 4 people on one 4-core machine, if all 4 people do something that hits up the CPU, I only have 4 cores to burst into, which is not enough. So the chances of me having 16 people on a 16-core machine and having all 16 people do something at the same time that would demand the CPU is very low. And so those who do spike the CPU, I have 16 cores to spike up to. All right, so that's why I like using fewer machines and larger machines as opposed to more machines and smaller machines. Okay. So here are those common sort of VM sizes. So B series are for light workloads without consistent use, best for like domain controllers. D series are good, are well-balanced machines. And then your E series are your machines with more RAM. And those are the ones I like using in a WVD environment because we have lots of opportunities for customers to leave many tabs open, right? E series machines have double the amount of RAM compared to a D series machine for only 15% more cost. So that's not much at all, and I'm getting double the RAM. So if I do like an E16 ASV4 machine, that thing comes with 128 gigs of RAM. You have 16 people in that machine, you have 128 divided by 16, then each user effectively gets about 8 gigs per user, which is your standard modern desktop. Right, and of course, nobody's really fully using 8 gigs, so if somebody uses more, that's fine because somebody else is not going to use the full 8 gigs. And then finally, you have your N series machines, which are the GPU machines. So the point here is not to learn every single VM family in Azure because you'll never learn it all. Just learn the ones you'll use 98% of the time and you'll be fine. Any questions about this? And we can obviously get more to it. Every single digit in that SKU means something, like a D, and then 8 is the CPU processor. S means it's got temporary storage. V is the version and generation, and 3, right? If you look at the WVD pools, you have an E16 ASV4, and E means double the memory. 16 means 16 cores. A means AMD. S means a VM with a temporary disk, and then version 4. And to know what they are, you have to go to the Azure documentation and sort of look at what the version 4 means. Version 4 means it's using the latest EPYC Rome EPYC 2 processor. That goes back to what we know really well, which is on-prem processors. Okay, so we figured all this stuff out. Are you running QuickBooks on it? Blah blah blah. Anything running SQL? So you want to add a SQL server, perhaps, right? A full core 16 gig RAM SQL server. So that's how you use Section 3. Section 3 kind of helps you build out your infrastructure and shows you exactly what to build. And for the data disk, make sure you pick premium disks. Don't go with anything like spinning disk or standard disk. It's not going to perform well. Okay. And if you have a customer working more than your average 40-hour work week, I would change that thing where it says this collection will be maxed out at 50 hours. It's going to, basically spin on all your machines for at least 50 hours before spinning it back down, so we can calculate and calculate that cost. Okay, so Section 4 is about licensing. So the license you need at the minimum is that Microsoft 365 Business Premium license. Again, a lot of people ask me, do you buy this from Nerdio? No, you buy it for your distributor. We're just showing you what the cost of the ownership of this entire solution is with the license if you want us to. Some people say, oh, I already own it, I'm just going to make them pay the difference, or maybe they already have E3. I just swap it out, and you could just uncheck that box if you don't want us to calculate that. So the Section 5 is really important. Azure Hybrid Benefit. You should always make sure you buy a CSP subscription for Windows Server licensing. So I always pick either CSP subscription 1 year or 3 years, and I always pick 3 year for a reservation. So Manny, there's no more penalties for anything. So if you have any 1 year reservations, switch it to 3 year because why not make 33% more money just by doing nothing, right? You can cancel anytime, there's no penalty. Backup, we want to say yes. You know, do you want to add a region? Do you want a site-to-site VPN? So all those questions you kind of answer yes or no to. And then if you want to specify the backup, you can say, I want 14 days daily retention, once a week for 4 weeks, and then once a month for 3 months, and then once a year for 1 year. You can kind of adjust those in the calculator. Are you guys following along in yours?
I missed this last jump between the two. I was still answering the questions on
Okay.
the other features section.
So it's backup, outer region, yes or no, site-to-site VPN, yes or no. Do you plan on, bringing your existing on-prem into Azure? I would not worry about on-ramp region and auto scale.
So let me ask a question. In regards to establish a VPN, the DR replication to another Azure region, is it not more expensive to go between regions?
It is, yeah. So all that math is calculated for you. So most people don't do outer DR region because of the extra cost. You can kind of click back and forth, yes or no, and you kind of see it in the little box on the left-hand side what the ramifications of doing that is. And a lot of people just freak out and say, oh, never mind. Because in-region backup should be sufficient. In-region backup is 3 backups in 3 parts of the Azure region. And these regions are not a single building. It's multiple clusters of buildings spread across geography. That's what constitutes a region. So if you back up with in-region backup, your data is in 3 physically separate locations, sometimes hundreds of miles away from each other. So most of the time, in-region backup is just fine unless you have a compliance need for out-of-region DR.
And in the VPN, establishing a VPN between Azure and your location?
Yeah, so that's if you have a customer that has an office and you want a VPN between Azure and your site for some reason. So maybe you have a MFP copier that does scan to network folder that could go through the VPN. Maybe you have a employee time clock thing hanging on the wall where a customer, end user comes in, walks in, hand punches in there, and then the application that manages all that is running in the server in Azure. You can use a VPN for that. So there's different scenarios where you might need a VPN. But again, if you move everything 100% to the cloud, you may not need a VPN.
What if you have a printer at the office that you want the people to print to? Wouldn't you need a VPN for that?
Yes and no. So you can do a VPN if you do like a static printer and set up that printer inside the file server and use the file server as a print server, or you can rely on the WVD redirection, which works really well. So if you want to do that, then no. Okay, so we kind of talked about some of this. Bandwidth. So in the next section, we have bandwidth. So we estimate that an average user will use about $1.50 worth of egress bandwidth a month. So Microsoft doesn't charge anything when data goes into Azure, but they'll charge something when data leaves Azure. So when you're using WVD, the pixels being redrawn on your screen, that accounts to be about $1.50 per user per month for a typical user. Okay, storage operations. I don't really leave that alone. I don't change that. I leave it at 3 cents per gig. If you have any personal VMs for like a one-to-one dedicated VMs, you specify that here, where you say every single personal VM might be a full core 16 gig of RAM. If you selected that, you can adjust that. If not, that remains grayed out. This is also important. Depending on who your CSP distributor is, you should know your Azure discounts, right? So if you're a PAX8, I think they start you off with 9%. You might be at 16% for your Office 365. You might be at 0% for your Azure Reserve instance. If you're with Ingram Micro, it might be 2 or 3%. So they all vary. So you got to find out what they are so you can put them in here so you can figure out what your real TCO is.
Do you know what it is for SureWeb?
They start you at 5. I don't know what they have different levels and tiers, right? If you do more business with them, you might be at the 7 level or 9 level, 10 level. You should ask your rep and find out.
Yeah.
Ask Michael Kamo, yeah. And then finally, the region. So where you are and where you decide to put your infrastructure is very important because not all regions perform the same and not all regions cost the same. So if you're in the East Coast, the cheapest region is East US 2. If you're in South Central, you really don't have any options. You have Texas or Dallas. That's actually one of the more expensive regions. If you're in the Chicago North Central area, that's Chicago is also very expensive, but not only is it expensive, it doesn't have the latest gear. So you might as well use Central US and Iowa, which is close enough, and it also has the latest gear, and it's also cheap. If you're in the western part of the United States, you have two options there, about to be a third one. You have your West 2, which is in Seattle, which is very, very cheap. You have your West 1, which is in San Diego, which is not as cheap. And then you have one coming soon in Arizona. So those are your options. And ideally, you want to pick the region not based on price, but based on vicinity to your customer. Because the closer it is to your customer, the better round trip experience you're going to get. Okay, so the output looks something like this, right? And I'm just going to take this and then show you guys how an MSP would typically mark this up and make margin, right? See how much time we have. We have a couple of minutes left. So it's building your package. So that cost, the output was $63 per user per month, which includes the cost of my Azure, my 365 licensing, my Nerdio licensing, my total per month, kind of all divided by 27 users is $63 a month. And here's how I build my offer, right? I have $63 a month comes from the Nerdio cost estimator. Maybe I charge $30 a month for my help desk. Maybe my ID agent costs $22. Maybe my RMM costs $4. Maybe I'm paying for extra Microsoft 365 backup. My total out of pocket from the MSP perspective is about 103. If I want to make 45% market margin, then I need to be selling this at 185 a seat, right? Every month per user. So in the US, the average sell price for a solution like this, and you can kind of package it whatever way you want, but the average sell price is somewhere between 180 to 250 USD. So if you're over that, great. So I have clients in New York that are charging like $300-400 a seat. And then, but if you're under that 180 number, you're not making enough money. Okay, so that's sort of the goal and the range you want to be at. So then the next step is, a client says, yes, good. Then, obviously you work with us to kind of help you deploy it. And then finally, I want to talk about this promotion. So Microsoft is paying for Nerdio licenses on your behalf for 6 months. If you have a new customer starting to set up and have set up by June 30th. So Lydia, if you have that other one you want to do it by June 30th and you get 6 months of free Nerdio licenses. So depending on how many seats you have, that could be a significant amount of money being saved. Nerdio will provide you 2 onboarding engineers to help you sort of onboard your customers. Even if you've already taken advantage of them in the past, you can get 2 more new ones as for this promo. Microsoft's paying for that as well. Yeah, that's about it. So any questions about any of this?
I do, real quick. There was no discussion at all about latency and how we measure latency between in the Windows environment from wherever to back to the data center. Is there some place where we could check that out?
Yeah, so great question. So you go to, I think, azurespeed.com or .net. Yeah, if you go to azurespeed.net, what this tool does is it's from wherever you are, it's going to go and check the latency between some of the reasons you tick off. All right, so I'm in New York, so obviously if I go to South Africa, my latency is going to be really bad. So what you can see is the ones you check off, this chart does a consistent ping test or latency test, and it shows you based on the regions you've ticked off what the latency is. So if I go, so obviously my closest one's going to probably be the US. Central is going to be a little bit more. And if I click like South Africa or something, you should see something else spike up really, really bad. But from a latency perspective, anything under 100 milliseconds is deemed to be good enough for WVD. Obviously, the lower the better.
What about if you have GPUs deployed?
So GPUs are not available in every region. So South Central has GPU, East has GPU, West 2 has GPU. So hopefully you're close to one of those, but you're not. You have to pick a region with GPUs. But yeah, they respond the same.
Okay.
Yeah. There's another thing you could do to reduce your latency. There's something called RDP short path. It's a feature for WVD. Essentially, if you have a VPN tunnel between you and the Azure region, it'll bypass the public gateway brokers and probably decrease your latency by even half. So right now, if I'm going through the public internet, my latency to Azure is 25. But if I had that feature turned on, it would reduce me down to like 15 or 10.
Where do you turn that on at? It's
inside Nerdio. It's a feature inside of WVD.
Okay.
I'll short path.
Short path. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll review all those things with everybody here when we do this stuff. So don't worry about not like remembering this. This is just a sort of a quick thing. So, hopefully everybody on this call now sort of gets how I quote and the things I think about when I do it. And, the goal here is to teach everybody here how to fish. So, and we're always here to kind of, what I like to do is you could do a couple of your own, send it to me and say, hey, did I do it right? And I'll look it over and say, hey, change this to do that. And I'll tell you why. Right. And after a couple of the back and forth like that, you'll understand this as well as I do. I promise. Right. So, any other questions?
And you
Great.
will send out the, what did I write down? You'll send out the list of qualifying questions?
Yeah, I'll send out. Yeah, Lane, can I send that to you and you or should I give it to Janet?
Yeah, no, send it to me and I can send it out to everybody.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I'll send you a couple of other resources as well, like the cheat sheet of different VMs. I think that's also a good one.
Great. Thanks,
All right.
Tony.
All right, appreciate it, guys. Thanks
All
so
right.
much.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everybody.
Lydia, let me know when you want to talk.
I'll
Thank
see
you.
you at 3:30.
Oh, you're